In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how I made this beautiful Cypress bench. It all started after I made a beautiful Cypress dining room table for a gentleman. He was going to use it in his North Carolina log home. And he said that because lots of grandchildren will be using this table, he would like me to build for him a matching bench. I'd never built a bench before, but I knew I could do it. So I said, yes, I'll build you a bench. I got to work on it. Started out by going up to Avon Park, checking out the local sawmill up there who's made slabs. This is what I started at. This is what I finished up with. Pardon me. A beautiful Cypress slab. This is what I started with. 2 of those Cypress slabs I bought from the sawmill up in Avon Park. The larger one will become the bench seat. The smaller one on the left side will be the bench legs. This larger one was 2.5 inches thick. The smaller one was about 2 1/4. This way I would have plenty of support on that bench seat. You never have to worry about it sagging. These are the dimensions: 78 inches long, 17 inches wide, 18 inches high. Perfect size. First step in this process is to trim the bench seat to the right size, 78 inches. Due to the fact this piece was very thick, 2.5 inches, my saw would not go all the way through it, so I had to finish it off with my Japanese bonsai saw. It's a good saw, but on a piece this long, 78 inches, you could give yourself a few blisters. Also, I only had to do this on one side of the bench seat because I was going to leave one edge to be a what you call live edge. I like to call them wild edges. Here's where you get some exercise. I had to finish it off with this Japanese saw. Again, it works well, but it can produce a few blisters. Once you get that one piece off and you've got the bench cut to size, next you want to prep the live edge side. That was a relief. Now I'm going to flip it up on its side and go to work on the live edge. Luckily, this piece was well dried at the sawmill. The bark came off like peeling a banana. It's quite easy. It's always a pleasure when that happens. We get the live edge finished, and now we're ready to go to work on finishing the piece. I use a 3-step sanding method. The first is a angle grinder with a 36 grit pad on it. Then I use a polisher with an 80 grit blade. And then I use the old faithful orbital sander with an 80 grit pad. I'm finishing the seat part of the bench now. I'll work on the legs later with that small piece. I found this would do it sufficiently because I use a pour-on epoxy method. That will cover up many little flaws in the wood. And of course, since children are going to be sitting at this bench, I rounded off the edges on the inside so that no one will scratch their legs when they're sitting on this wonderful bench. The next step in this bench building process is to prepare the wood to be used for the legs. The small slab that I got from the sawmill worked perfectly to cut it into 4 equal pieces. That way I could put 2 pieces together to make a 5-inch wide log. Also decided to remove the bark to give it a more clean look. Whatever you call it, it turned out to be real well. Again, it was very fortunate that one slab was the perfect length to make the 4 pieces that will be made into the 2 legs. Here I am removing the bark from the leg pieces with the only real sophisticated piece of equipment I have, a miter saw. Here I am applying the Titebond 3 glue to these 2 pieces. I used every clamp in the house to clamp these 2 pieces together. As you can see, the legs will be 5 inches wide, which will give them lots of stability when I attach them to the bench. After a day, I removed the clamps, and there I have a 1-piece thick bench leg. That's what they're going to look like. Now that I had them cut and put together, it was time to finish them. Here I am using step 1 with my angle grinder with a 36 grit flap. After that, I went to step 2, using my grinder with a 80 grit pad on it, finishing it up with the good old reliable radial sander with 80 grit pads. Again, with the method of pouring on epoxy, you don't have to worry too much about getting it perfect. And here I am applying a coat of my favorite Deft Lacquer Sanding Sealer. This is what keeps the wood from turning dark when you apply the epoxy. I discovered that the hard way a few times with my first ones. Next step is to prepare the bottom of the bench to receive the legs. I do this by routing out a 1-inch deep hole into the bottom of the bench, matching the size of the legs. I have found that epoxy is quite strong enough to hold the legs together and give the bench plenty of strength. It does take a few minutes to route out this hole. It's about 18 or 19 inches long and maybe 10 inches wide and 1 inch deep. I hope to be able to do it with the standard base on my router, but was not so lucky. Had to put my expanded base on it, which did work quite well, because you want to have the bottom of this hole extremely smooth, because the legs are going to be sitting in it and you want them to be level and perpendicular to the bench. This is good exercise in showing man over wood using a router. Takes a while, but the effort is worth it. Finally, the leg receptors are finished and it is time to mount the legs. I did this by putting the leg down into the receptor hole and bracing it to make sure it was 90 degrees or perpendicular to the bench. Once both legs were forevermore attached to the bench with epoxy, I applied the base coat of epoxy to the bottom of the bench. I always put a base coat on the bottom of anything, a bench or table or whatever, to seal the wood up so that it will last longer. Then I put some on the legs. In this case, I wanted to put felt on the bottom of the legs to add a little bit to them when they put them on the floor, if they put them on a slick floor. As you can see here, I used epoxy to attach the felt to the bottom of the legs. I would not recommend that in the future, but what I found here is when you put the felt on the epoxy on the bottom of the legs, the epoxy would cause the felt to get stiff and hard. It would be much better just to use spray-on Elmer's glue or whatever brand you like and attach them. Once that was done, it was time to turn over the bench and go to work on the top. Before I could begin, you had to clean up the top a little bit because some of the epoxy dripped over the edge. I removed all of that first before I started finishing the top of the bench. As you can see, I'm using my trusty angle grinder, probably my favorite tool. The primary purpose is to remove all the drips so it'll be smooth. Now we get to the time when we start pouring the epoxy on the top of the bench. We're getting very close to finishing it up. If you noticed here, I put plastic underneath. It's very important to put plastic underneath whenever you're pouring epoxy because otherwise, before long, your floor would raise up 3 or 4 feet from the excess epoxy that drips on the floor. Here I am adding my favorite deft lacquer sanding sealer to the top of the bench. This is to ensure that the beautiful cypress wood will retain its natural beauty. Now I am applying the first coat of epoxy. We always call this a base coat. We put it on primarily to seal the top and to fill up any holes where air is lurking down in the wood that will bubble up to the top when you apply the final coats. Now we're getting serious. We're going to mix up the epoxy that I'm going to pour onto the bench. Whenever you're pouring it on, it takes much more epoxy than just painting it on. I do that because it gives a much nicer finish. And here I am, pouring it on and letting it flow. There's no work involved other than just pouring on the epoxy and letting it spread out and cover the piece of wood completely. I do this 3 times. This gives you a good, strong finish, and also a finish that will look good for years. On the sides, I apply it with a brush. It does not work when you float it onto the sides of the bench, but it looks real good when you paint it on. Finish it off by using the old bubble popper and burn off any bubbles that may appear. And then your masterpiece is finished except for one final step. You have to flip it over on its top and grind off the drips. I prefer to grind them rather than try to cut them off while they're still wet. This way, it removes them quicker and you can shape the edge to add a little extra touch to it. You can see those legs there. They are substantial. They're 5 inches wide and they're sitting in 1 inch of epoxy. You cannot remove them with a sledgehammer. If you've liked what you hear and see on this video, do me a favor, subscribe to my channel, also like this video. I'm showing you this video to indicate how relatively easy it is for a non-woodworking person to make nice pieces of lumber. I made the table and then I made a bench for them, and this is the finished bench. It is beautiful, comfortable to sit on, and substantial. It's not likely to flip over when those children are playing on it, and the edges have been rounded so it won't hurt their legs. And there you see a beautiful bench. I encourage anybody out there who has an idea that they might like to work with wood to follow my example and make some things. I think you'll be surprised at how relatively easy it is and how much satisfaction you get from seeing the beautiful wood and all that grain that God created. It is a wonderful thing. Again, please subscribe to my channel and like this video.